I never thought I'd be the kind of person counting dirty coffee mugs like they were evidence in a murder case. But when someone slowly poisons the peace inside your own home, you start noticing every little thing. Every plate left on the table, every soda can abandoned beside the recliner, every muddy footprint dragged across the kitchen floor like a reminder that your comfort doesn't matter. And the worst part? The man doing it acted like it was completely normal. My boyfriend Jake felt responsible for him, and Jake was a good man. Too good. The kind of good that survives childhood trauma and still somehow feels guilty for not doing more for the people who caused it. Ron had spent decades terrorizing his family. Everyone knew it. Nobody said it directly, but they all carried it in their posture around him. His wife spoke softly whenever he entered a room. His daughters avoided eye contact. Jake turned into a completely different person whenever his dad criticized him. Like a little boy again. I hated seeing it. The stories I'd heard over the years were horrific. Ron controlled every aspect of his wife's life. Never let her learn to drive because he didn't want her independent. Expected dinner served exactly at 6. Expected his laundry folded a certain way. Expected women to clean up after him like they were born employees. And then there were the things nobody in the family talked about openly. The things whispered during emotional breakdowns after too much wine on holidays. The things involving children. I remember the first time Jake told me. We were sitting in his truck outside my apartment years ago, and he looked physically sick saying it out loud. His father had abused people, hurt people, family members, children. I'd stared at him waiting for the punchline. Waiting for him to say he was joking or exaggerating. He never did. What happened? I asked quietly. Jake just shook his head. They buried it, he said. Everybody buried it. And somehow, despite knowing all of that, here I was years later letting this man live in my house half the month because his family said he had nowhere else to go. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I was supporting Jake. I told myself people change after strokes. That last one was the dumbest lie of all. A stroke didn't make Ron kinder. It just made him slower. The entitlement was still there. The cruelty was still there. And apparently the expectation that women existed to clean up after him survived just fine. At first I tried being patient. Hey Ron, I said one afternoon, forcing a smile. Could you put your dishes in the sink when you're done? He looked at me for a second like I'd spoken another language. Then he grunted and turned back toward the television. I figured maybe he genuinely didn't hear me. The second time, I asked again while pointing directly at the plate sitting on the coffee table. Sink, I said gently. Just put it in there when you're done. He nodded. An hour later, the plate was still there. Mashed potatoes hardening into cement. Jake apologized when he got home from work. I'll clean it, he said. That's not the point, I answered. I know. But nothing changed. Every single day I'd come home from work and find new messes waiting for me. Fast food wrappers. Empty cups. Napkins stuffed into couch cushions. Bowls sitting inches away from the kitchen like the man physically couldn't walk another 10 feet. Meanwhile, Jake kept making excuses. He had a rough day. He's still recovering. He forgets. No, he didn't forget. Ron remembered how to operate the TV remote. He remembered baseball stats from 1987. He remembered exactly when dinner should be ready. Funny how selective his helplessness was. One night I came home exhausted after a 12-hour shift and found chili spilled across the dining table. Not a small spill either. A full bowl tipped sideways with dried beans crusted into the wood. Ron sat in his recliner watching a Western. He didn't even look up. Something inside me snapped a little. Seriously? I asked. No response. I cleaned it in silence while he kept watching television like I was invisible. That night I told Jake I couldn't do it anymore. I'm not his maid, I said. You're right. He leaves everything for me on purpose. Jake rubbed his face tiredly. I'll talk to him again. You already did. I know. But talking didn't matter because Ron didn't respect anyone enough to change. Especially women. The next few days got worse after Jake confronted him again. Suddenly there were more dishes, more trash, more little acts of defiance. Passive-aggressive warfare from a 70-year-old man. One morning I walked into the kitchen and found an empty yogurt cup sitting directly beside the trash can instead of inside it. That was intentional.
And somehow that stupid yogurt cup made me angrier than anything else. Because it wasn't laziness anymore. It was a message. You clean up after me because that's your job. I stood there staring at it while rage bubbled in my chest. Then a thought crossed my mind that honestly felt childish the second I had it. Good. Maybe childish was exactly what he understood. The following morning I got ready for work in complete silence. Ron was planted in front of the television as usual, half asleep in his recliner. Before leaving, I grabbed the remote. Then I turned on Looney Tunes. Maximum volume. The room exploded with cartoon screaming and crashing cymbals. Ron jerked away immediately. "What the hell?" he barked. I smiled sweetly. "Oh, sorry," I said. Forgot to turn it down. Then I walked out the front door. Petty? Absolutely. But after months of feeling trapped inside my own house, I wanted him uncomfortable too. If I had to come home every day feeling anxious and disrespected, maybe he could spend a few hours listening to Bugs Bunny screaming through surround sound speakers. For the first time in months, I laughed during my drive to work. It didn't last. Because deep down, underneath the anger and the jokes and the passive-aggressive revenge fantasies, something uglier was growing. I couldn't stop asking myself one question. Why the hell was I protecting everyone else's comfort except my own? And once that question settled into my brain, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Batch 2. The Looney Tunes stunt became family legend for exactly one day. By the time I got home from work, Ron had figured out how to use the remote again. The television was blasting some old crime show while dirty dishes sat untouched on the coffee table like trophies. 2 plates. 1 empty pudding cup. A crushed soda can. And somehow seeing that mess after my tiny moment of victory just made me feel pathetic. Ron looked at me when I walked in, then glanced toward the dishes. Almost smug. That's when it hit me. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't confusion from old age or recovery from a stroke. This was a power game. And he'd been playing it his entire life. I cleaned up in silence because I was too angry to trust my mouth. Every scrape of ceramic against the sink felt violent. Jake came home an hour later and instantly sensed the mood. "You okay?" "No." He sighed before even asking why. That irritated me more. Because he already knew. He knew exactly what was wrong before I said a word, which meant this had become normal to him. Dad forgot again? He didn't forget. Jake leaned against the counter quietly. "He's old," he muttered. "And he's a rapist." The room went completely still. Jake looked down at the floor. I instantly regretted saying it like that. Not because it wasn't true, but because I saw the pain hit him in real time. People think anger is loud, but sometimes the worst kind is quiet. Jake just stood there staring at the tile like a little kid being punished for something he didn't do. "I know," he said softly. "No, I don't think you do." That came out harsher than I intended. I sat down at the kitchen table and buried my face in my hands. "I can't keep living like this," I whispered. Jake didn't answer immediately. Finally, he said, "He doesn't have anywhere else." I laughed bitterly. That's not my problem. The words shocked even me, because I'd spent months trying to be understanding, trying to support Jake, trying to prove I wasn't selfish. But somewhere along the way, I'd sacrificed my own peace to protect a monster from consequences. And I was done. The next morning was my day off. Jake left early for work after promising we'd seriously talk that night. Ron shuffled into the living room around 9 wearing stained sweatpants and immediately started barking for help with the TV. Not asking. Barking. "The remote ain't working." I didn't move from the couch. "It's working." "No, it ain't. It worked yesterday." He glared at me like I was a disobedient bleatess. Then he pushed the voice command button over and over. The robotic assistant kept repeating itself at full volume. "Let me recommend. Let me recommend. Let me recommend." Over and over. It felt deliberate. Like he knew exactly how irritating it was. Finally, I got up and switched the channel before my head exploded. Ron smirked. Actually smirked. That tiny expression made something cold settle inside me. This man enjoyed making women miserable. Not just me. All women. His wife, his daughters, every female relative who'd spent decades tiptoeing around him to avoid conflict. I suddenly understood how abuse survives inside families for generations. Not because people don't recognize it, but because they become exhausted. They learn survival instead of resistance. I refused to become another exhausted woman orbiting around this man's comfort. Before leaving to run errands, I handed him the lunch Jake prepared earlier. Then I looked him dead in the eyes. "Clean your mess before I get home." His expression hardened instantly. For a split second, despite his age and weakness, I saw exactly who he used to be. The younger version. The dangerous version. It sent chills through me. I left anyway. While driving, my thoughts spiraled hard. I started replaying every compromise I'd made to keep peace in this family. Every holiday I swallowed discomfort. Every creepy comment I ignored. Every moment I minimized my own instincts because I didn't want to burden Jake more than he already was. That realization hurt the most. Jake was a victim too. He grew up terrorizing this man. And now, even as an adult, he still felt responsible for him. By the time I got home that evening, I'd made up my mind. Ron couldn't stay anymore. I opened the front door. The dishes were still there. Of course they were. A bowl with dried soup stuck to the bottom sat on the end table beside crumpled napkins and spilled crackers. Ron was asleep in his recliner with the television blaring. I just stood there staring at the mess. Then something inside me finally snapped completely. "Are you kidding me?" Ron startled awake.
I barely slept that night. Every creak in the hallway made me tense. Every cough from the living room reminded me he was still there, still occupying space in my home like he owned it. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up trying to sleep and just stared at the ceiling while my thoughts spiraled. The thing nobody talks about with situations like this is how quickly your world starts shrinking. You stop relaxing in common areas. You stop speaking freely. You calculate every interaction before it happens. Even walking into my own kitchen started feeling like preparing for battle. And meanwhile, the person causing all the discomfort sits there completely unaffected. That part made me furious. Ron slept peacefully every night while the rest of us carried the emotional weight of his existence. The next morning, I found Jake sitting alone at the kitchen table before work, rubbing his temples with both hands. "You okay?" I asked carefully. He laughed once under his breath. "No." I poured coffee for both of us and sat across from him. For a minute, neither of us spoke. We were both exhausted in different ways. Finally, Jake looked at me. I talked to my mom again. "And?" She says we're overreacting. Of course she did. Women like her survive by minimizing reality. If she admitted how awful Ron really was, she'd have to admit she spent decades protecting him too. "What exactly are we overreacting to?" I asked. The abuse? The manipulation? Or the fact that he treats me like a maid? Jake stared into his coffee. "She says he's old and sick." I leaned back in my chair, stunned. "You know what really bothers me?" I said quietly. "Everybody keeps talking about his stroke like it erased everything he did before it." Jake didn't answer. Being disabled doesn't magically make someone a good person. I know. No, seriously. If anything, now everyone expects sympathy for him. Meanwhile, the people he hurt are still carrying all this trauma around like it's nothing. Jake nodded slowly. "I know." This time I believed him. That morning, before leaving for work, Jake spoke directly to his father again. I overheard most of it from the hallway. "Dad, you need to clean up after yourself." Ron grunted something unintelligible. "I mean it," Jake continued. "She's not your servant." That word hung in the air. Servant. Because deep down, Jake knew that was exactly how his father viewed women. Ron mired, "Women clean." I froze in the hallway. Jake went silent for a second before saying, "Not in this house." But even then, there wasn't real anger in his voice, just exhaustion. Like he'd spent his whole life trying to negotiate basic humanity out of this man. The second Jake left for work, Ron's behavior changed immediately. He turned the television volume all the way up, started slamming cabinets, muttering under his breath. I ignored him as long as I could, but eventually he shuffled into the kitchen while I was washing dishes. "You got attitude," he said suddenly. I turned around slowly. "I have boundaries." He scoffed like that was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. Then he pointed toward the sink. "Women nowadays lazy." That did it. Something cold settled over me instantly. I dried my hands carefully and faced him directly. "You know what's interesting?" I said calmly. "Men like you always talk about respect while treating everyone around you like garbage." Ron frowned. "You think because you're old, people have to tolerate your behavior. They don't." He opened his mouth, probably to say something disgusting, but I cut him off first. "You are in my house, not the other way around." For the first time since he moved in, he actually looked caught off guard. Not ashamed. Just surprised someone spoke back to him. Because people rarely ever had. That afternoon, I called out of work. Not because I was sick, but because mentally I was reaching a breaking point.
I sat in my car parked outside a grocery store for almost an hour trying not to cry from frustration. I kept replaying the situation in my head, asking myself the same question over and over. Why am I the only one reacting like this is insane? How had this family normalized something so deeply disturbing? Then I remembered something Jake once told me early in our relationship. When chaos is normal growing up, he said, peace feels uncomfortable. At the time, I didn't fully understand what he meant. Now I did. His family wasn't operating from logic. They were operating from survival. That realization softened some of my anger toward Jake, but not enough to keep sacrificing myself. When I got home later that evening, the house smelled awful. Old food, sweat, stale air. And sitting right in the middle of the coffee table was another mess waiting for me. Chicken bones. Sauce smeared across a paper plate. Used napkins. And beside it all sat Ron, half asleep in his recliner watching television. He looked at me, then looked at the mess, and smiled. Actually smiled. That tiny expression pushed me over the edge emotionally. Not because of the dishes, because it confirmed everything. He knew exactly what he was doing. This wasn't forgetfulness. This was dominance. A small, pathetic attempt to prove he could still control the environment around him. I walked straight past him without cleaning anything. For the first time since he moved in, I left the mess exactly where it was. Ron called after me almost immediately. "You gonna clean that?" I stopped in the hallway, slowly turned around, and said the one thing nobody in his family had probably ever told him before. No. The silence afterward felt enormous. Ron stared at me like he genuinely couldn't process what he'd heard. Then his face hardened with anger. Good. Let him be angry. I was done shrinking myself to make abusive people comfortable.
That night became the real turning point. Not because of some dramatic screaming match or cinematic confrontation, but because something finally shifted inside Jake. For months, he had been balancing between guilt and denial, trying to convince himself that keeping his father around was an act of compassion instead of obligation. But once he started seeing the behavior directly, really seeing it, the excuses got harder to hold on to. Especially after the "you gotta clean that" comment. I told Jake everything the second he got home. At first, he just stood there quietly listening while staring at the untouched plate still sitting on the coffee table. "He asked you that?" Jake said finally. "Yes." And smiled? "Yes." Jake looked toward the living room where Ron sat pretending not to listen to us. Then Jake did something I hadn't seen him do before. He got angry. Real anger. Not defensive frustration, not exhausted resignation. Actual anger. He walked into the living room and muted the television. "What is wrong with you?" he asked his father. Ron looked confused. Jake pointed at the mess. "You seriously asked her to clean up after you?" Ron shrugged. "She's the woman." The room went dead silent. Even Ron seemed unaware of how insane the sudden sounded out loud. Jake stared at him for several seconds, like he was finally seeing him clearly for the first time in years. Then he laughed once. But it wasn't amused laughter. It was disbelief. "You know," Jake said slowly, "I spent most of my life thinking if I just helped you enough, eventually you'd become a better person." Ron rolled his eyes. Jake nodded to himself, like that reaction proved something internally. "But you don't even want to be better." Ron scoffed. "You too soft." I watched Jake physically flinch at that sentence. Because there it was. The voice that raised him. The voice that probably mocked him every time he showed emotion growing up. Every time he cried. Every time he failed. Every time he tried being kind instead of cruel. Suddenly, I wasn't seeing an argument between two men. I was watching a wounded little boy finally realize his father would never love him properly. Jake took a deep breath. "You're leaving tomorrow." Ron sat upright immediately. "No." "Yes." "My house. My rules." The irony of hearing that phrase used against Ron after decades of him controlling everyone else almost felt poetic. Ron started muttering angrily under his breath. But Jake ignored him and walked straight back into the kitchen with me. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke.
Then Jake leaned against the counter and covered his face with both hands. "I'm sorry," he whispered. That broke me more than anything else. Not because I needed the apology, but because I realized how deeply the situation had damaged him too. "You don't have to apologize for his behavior," I said softly. "No," Jake answered. "But I should have protected you from it sooner." I walked over and hugged him tightly. For the first time in weeks, I felt like we were finally standing on the same side again, instead of being divided by the giant shadow Ron cast over everyone around him. The next morning was tense from the second we woke up. Ron barely spoke while throwing his things into trash bags with exaggerated movements designed to make as much noise as possible. Cabinet doors slammed. Drawers banged shut. Every action radiated anger. At one point, he looked directly at me and muttered, "Women ruin families." I almost laughed. Because abusive men always say that when women stop tolerating abuse. Jake heard him too. "No," Jake replied calmly. "Men like you ruin families." Ron didn't answer after that. His sister arrived around noon to pick him up. The second she walked through the door, the guilt tripping started. "He's old. He's sick. He doesn't mean half the things he says." Then she pulled me aside privately near the front door. "You know he had a hard childhood too," she whispered. I stared at her in disbelief. There it was again. The endless cycle of excuses. Every abusive person apparently came with a tragic backstory people used like a coupon for forgiveness. "So did your son," I answered quietly. "And somehow he still learned how to clean up after himself." She looked stunned. I think that was the first time anyone had pushed back on the family narrative directly. Before leaving, Ron stopped in the doorway and looked around the house one last time. For a brief second, I wondered if maybe, just maybe, there would be some tiny moment of accountability, an apology, recognition, anything. Instead, he looked directly at Jake and said, "She turned you weak." Jake didn't even hesitate. "No. She taught me what Momo looks like." And just like that, Ron left. The silence afterward felt unreal. No television blaring. No muttering. No tension sitting in the middle of every room. Just peace. Actual peace. Jake and I spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning the house together. We opened windows, washed blankets, took out piles of trash. It honestly felt less like cleaning and more like removing emotional residue. At one point, Jake stopped while washing dishes and suddenly started crying quietly. Not loud sobbing, just exhausted tears. "I hate that part of me still feels guilty," he admitted. I dried my hands and stood beside him. "That's what abuse does," I said gently. "It trains people to feel guilty for protecting themselves." He nodded slowly. That night we ordered takeout and sat together on the couch in complete silence. Not awkward silence. Comfortable silence. The kind that only exists when your nervous system finally realizes it's safe again. A few days later, I still took my birthday trip, but this time Jake came with me. We rented a tiny cabin near a lake a few hours away from the city. No family drama, no phone calls, no obligations. Just quiet. The second night there, we sat outside watching the water while the sun disappeared behind the trees. Jake looked over at me and said something I'll probably remember forever. "I spent my whole life thinking love meant enduring people." I squeezed his hand gently. "What do you think now?" He looked out at the lake for a long moment before answering. "I think love is supposed to feel safe. And honestly, after everything we survived in that house, that felt like the healthiest beginning either of us could have asked for."